I want to tell you about a man whose name you've probably never heard, but whose actions changed the course of the 20th century. His story isn't simple. There are no easy heroes or villains here, though by the end you'll have formed your own judgment. What makes this story worth your time is this: understanding how intelligent, capable people can convince themselves to do terrible things tells us something crucial about human nature and the world we still live in today. His name was Kenji Doihara, and if you ask historians who study the Pacific War what single individual bears the most responsibility for starting it all, his name comes up again and again. Not Tojo, not the Emperor, Doihara, the Spymaster, the manipulator, the man who engineered the incident that set Asia ablaze. But here's what makes his story genuinely fascinating. He wasn't a monster in the obvious sense. He was brilliant, cultured, spoke multiple languages fluently, and genuinely believed he was serving a higher purpose. Which raises a question that matters as much today as it did then. How do smart people talk themselves into catastrophic decisions? Stay with me, because we're going to explore not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it tells us about the decisions being made in corridors of power right now. Let's start at the beginning, in a place about as far from intrigue as you can imagine. A teacher's modest home in Okayama Prefecture, 1883. Young Kenji Doihara grew up in comfortable but unremarkable circumstances. Think of a bright kid in a small town, the kind who wins prizes at school and whose parents have ambitions for him. Japan itself was transforming at breathtaking speed. If you remember your history, the Meiji Restoration was only 15 years old when Doihara was born. The country was frantically modernizing, sending young men abroad to learn Western ways, building railroads and factories, creating a modern army and navy from scratch. There was an intoxicating sense that Japan could, and should, take its place among the great powers. Doihara entered the Imperial Japanese Army Academy and graduated in 1904, just as Japan shocked the world by defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Imagine the pride, the confidence that victory instilled. A small Asian nation had beaten one of Europe's empires. Anything seemed possible. But what set Doihara apart from thousands of other young officers wasn't tactical brilliance or martial prowess. It was language. He had an extraordinary gift for learning Chinese, not just Mandarin, but various dialects, the subtle differences in accent and vocabulary that told you exactly where someone came from. By the 1920s, he could pass as a Chinese merchant in most of northern China. For a military intelligence officer, this was pure gold. And here's where his story starts to get morally complicated, because Doihara genuinely loved China. He loved its culture, its history, its people. He spoke the language better than most foreign diplomats. He made Chinese friends. He understood the civilization in ways few Japanese ever did. Which makes what came next all the more disturbing. Because that understanding, that knowledge, that affection, he used all of it as a weapon. Before we get to the famous incident that started everything, I need to tell you about opium. Because you can't understand Doihara without understanding how he used narcotics as a tool of imperial policy. By the 1920s, Doihara was working in military intelligence in Manchuria, that northeastern region of China that Japan had long coveted for its resources and strategic position. And he made a discovery that would shape his entire career. Opium was the perfect tool for control. Here's how it worked. You identify useful people, Chinese officials, businessmen, local leaders, anyone with influence or information. You introduce them to opium in social settings, just recreational use at first, nothing serious. But opium is insidious. Before long, recreational use becomes dependency. Dependency becomes desperation, and desperate people do what you tell them to do. Doihara didn't invent this tactic. European colonial powers had used it before. But he perfected it, systematized it, turned it into a science. He ran networks of informants throughout northern China, many of them trapped by addiction into working for Japanese intelligence. He established opium dens that served as both intelligence-gathering centers and profit-making enterprises, funneling money back to fund more operations. Think about the moral calculation involved. These were real people, fathers, sons, husbands, whose lives he was systematically destroying to advance Japanese interests. And Doihara, who loved Chinese culture, who spoke the language beautifully, who could quote Chinese poetry, he did this without apparent hesitation, which brings us to a question worth pausing on. How do intelligent people rationalize such things? The answer, I think, is that they convince themselves they're serving something larger. For Doihara, that larger thing was Japan's destiny to lead Asia, to free it from Western imperialism, to create what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In his mind, individual suffering was justified by the grand historical mission. This kind of thinking, sacrificing present humanity for future utopia, appears again and again in history, from different ideologies, in different countries. Which is why understanding how it works in one context helps us recognize it in others. Now we come to the night of September 18, 1931. A railway track outside Mukden in Manchuria, and an explosion that would eventually lead to 20 million deaths. Let me set the scene carefully because the details matter. The South Manchurian Railway was owned and operated by Japan, part of the concessions won after the Russo-Japanese War. But Manchuria itself was Chinese territory, though weakly controlled by a warlord named Zhang Shuiliang. Japan's Kwantung Army, the force protecting Japanese interests in the region, had grown increasingly frustrated with Chinese nationalism and what they saw as threats to Japanese rights. Some officers, Doihara prominent among them, decided to solve the problem with deception. If Chinese forces could be blamed for an attack on the railway, Japan would have justification for military action. Control of Manchuria would be secured. The government in Tokyo, dominated by cautious civilians who favored diplomacy, would be presented with a fait accompli. So they planted explosives on the track north of Mukden, near a Japanese-controlled depot. The blast was actually quite small. A train passed over the damaged section moments later without derailing, but it was enough. The Kwantung Army immediately claimed Chinese sabotage and launched a full-scale offensive. By the next morning, Mukden was in Japanese hands. Within months, all of Manchuria had fallen. The puppet state of Manchukuo was established, with the last Qing emperor, Puyi, installed as its nominal ruler. Another Doihara operation, by the way. He personally negotiated with Puyi, appealing to the ex-emperor's vanity and his dreams of restoration. Now here's what makes this moment so significant for world history. It worked. The civilian government in Tokyo was furious but powerless. The military had created facts on the ground. International condemnation from the League of Nations meant nothing. Japan demonstrated that a determined military force could simply ignore civilian authority, international law, and diplomatic niceties, and get away with it. You know what signal that sent to militarists around the world? In Germany, a certain Adolf Hitler was paying very close attention. But there's something I want you to understand about this moment, because it's relevant to how democracies fail and how wars start. It happens by increments, not all at once. The Mukden Incident didn't immediately lead to full-scale war with China. That came 6 years later, in 1937. In between, there was constant escalation, each step seeming small enough to justify, each violation of Chinese sovereignty rationalized as necessary response to Chinese provocations. Doihara was at the center of these incremental moves. He negotiated agreements that ceded more Chinese territory. He ran intelligence operations that undermined Chinese authority. He helped install compliant officials and eliminate troublesome ones, always pushing, always expanding the boundaries of what Japan could get away with. The Western powers protested but did nothing meaningful. The League of Nations condemned but imposed no real penalties. The Chinese government, weak and divided between nationalists and communists, could offer only scattered resistance. And with each successful encroachment, the hardliners in Tokyo grew bolder. If you can take Manchuria without serious consequence, why not Inner Mongolia? Why not more of northern China? Why not just remove the nationalist government entirely and install a regime friendly to Japan? By 1937, when an incident at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing sparked full-scale war, the mechanism was already in place. The pattern had been established, and Doihara, now a major general commanding actual combat divisions, was part of the military machine rolling across China. Which brings us to the hardest part of this story to tell, but also the most important to understand if we're to grasp the full scope of what Doihara's earlier deceptions had unleashed. I need to be honest with you about what comes next. Some of you may have read about what happened in Nanking in December 1937. Some may prefer not to know the details. I'm going to tell you what happened, but I'm going to do it in a way that respects both the historical necessity of remembering and your dignity as listeners. After months of bitter fighting, Japanese forces captured Shanghai and advanced toward Nanking, then the capital of nationalist China. The Chinese defenders, poorly led and increasingly demoralized, abandoned the city. What should have been a straightforward occupation turned into something far darker. For 6 weeks, from mid-December into January, Japanese soldiers rampaged through the city, essentially without control. The commanding officer, General Iwane Matsui, was either unable or unwilling to impose discipline. The result was one of the 20th century's worst atrocities. The numbers are staggering, but difficult to verify precisely. Somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and surrendered soldiers were killed. Not in combat, but in organized executions, random murders, bayonet practice, live burials. Tens of thousands of women and girls were sexually assaulted, many murdered afterward. The city burned. Foreign missionaries and businessmen who remained documented what they saw. Their reports filled with disbelief that disciplined soldiers of a modern nation could behave this way. Now, Doihara's division wasn't in Nanking itself during those weeks. He was operating in northern China, so he didn't personally participate in those specific atrocities. But here's why his story is connected. The war that created the conditions for Nanking began with the false flag operation he helped engineer 6 years earlier at Mukden. When you start a conflict based on lies, when you teach your officers that deception and manipulation are acceptable tools, when you cultivate an attitude that sees enemies as less than human, you create the conditions for discipline to collapse and for ordinary men to commit extraordinary evil. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which we'll come to shortly, convicted Doihara not for Nanking specifically, but for conspiracy to wage aggressive war and for creating the system that enabled such atrocities. They recognized that the Spymaster who lit the fuse bore responsibility for the explosion that followed. But Nanking wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. The war Doihara helped start expanded relentlessly. By 1940, he'd been promoted to the Supreme War Council, the small group of senior officers who made Japan's most crucial strategic decisions. And here's where his story intersects with yours, if you're old enough to remember or had parents who lived through World War II. Because in December 1941, Doihara was one of the voices supporting the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought America into the war. Think about that chain of causation, an explosion on a railway track in Manchuria in 1931. A puppet state established, a pattern of aggression normalized, a war with China that wouldn't end, resources running short, an embargo by America, Britain and the Dutch,
Descent from the
a
great
decision that
sun
attacking
goddess
the Western powers
Amaterasu.
was preferable to backing
They
down.
believe that he personally
Pearl Harbor,
owns Japan,
the Pacific
its
War,
land,
Hiroshima
its resources,
and Nagasaki.
and
I'm not
even
saying Doihara
themselves.
caused all of that alone.
And they believe
History
that
is
it
never
is
that
the
simple.
right and
But
destiny
his
of
fingerprints
Japan's
are on the chain
emperors
of decisions that
to
led
rule
from
the
that first
whole
deception
world.
to the deaths of
To bring
millions
about
across
the
Asia and the
fulfillment of
Pacific.
this destiny
After Pearl
and
Harbor,
to destroy all
Doihara
nations
commanded
and
armies in
peoples
Southeast Asia,
which stand
Malaya,
in the way of its
Singapore,
fulfillment
Sumatra.
is the
Everywhere he
sacred
went,
duty
the same
of
patterns
Japan's
followed.
army
Harsh
and
treatment
navy.
of prisoners,
The
exploitation
army of
local
Japan is a
populations,
well-trained,
use of forced labor.
sternly
The
disciplined
vision of an
force
Asian
of fanatics
co-prosperity
steel
sphere
to
led by
reckless
Japan
courage
turned out to mean
by a
Japanese
primitive
domination
moral
with a
code
thin veneer of
which
anti-colonial
assures to
rhetoric.
every man
By
who dies in
1945,
battle
when American
an
bombers were
immortal
incinerating
life
Japanese
among
cities
the
and the
Shinto
Soviet
gods.
Union declared war, even Doihara must have known it was over. The grand
Behind
dream
the
had become a
fighting
nightmare.
forces stand all the
The mission
wealth
to free
and
Asia
power
had left it in ruins.
and resources
The surrender
of
came
a
in
people
August
whose national
1945.
dream
General
is
Douglas
to see
MacArthur,
Tokyo
now Supreme
established
Commander of the
as
Allied
the
powers in
capital
occupied Japan,
of the world.
ordered the arrest of
From
suspected war
Tokyo,
criminals.
the Japanese have
Kenji
for over
Doihara's
11
name was near
years
the top of the list.
been carrying on
The International
one
Military
long,
Tribunal for the Far East,
uninterrupted
the
war.
Tokyo Trials,
Again
as
and
they're usually
again,
called,
Western
opened in
economists
May
have predicted
1946 in the
that
former
Japan's
Japanese
economy
Army
must
headquarters
soon
building.
collapse.
If you
But
remember
Japan
the
is
Nuremberg trials
stronger
happening around
today
the same time
than
in Germany,
ever before in
Tokyo
its
was the
history.
Pacific equivalent,
An
though less
adaptable
well known
people,
in the West.
the Japanese have
28
made good
defendants
use
sat
of
in
the
the dock,
inventions
the leadership
and
of wartime
conveniences
Japan,
of the Western
generals,
world,
admirals,
which might
cabinet
fit
ministers,
in
diplomats.
with the plan for
Among
world
them,
conquest,
63-year-old Kenji
which is
Doihara,
their
now
national
just a prisoner
obsession.
in a cheap suit. The uniform and decorations
Non-essential
gone.
industries
The
in
trials
Japan
lasted over 2
have
years.
been all but
Imagine
wiped
sitting
out.
through 2 years
the
of
empire
testimony
has
about the worst
recognized
things
but
human
one
beings can do
need,
to each other.
the
The
need for the
prosecution presented
materials
evidence of aggression,
of war.
atrocities, violations of the laws of war. The defense argued that Japan
Efforts
had been
to
acting in
hold down
self-defense,
prices
that
have
Western
failed,
imperialism had
and
threatened
inflation
Japanese
has
security,
decreased the purchasing
that the victors
power
were imposing
of
their
the
justice
yen.
on the vanquished. Doihara sat largely silent through it all. He
Japan's
offered no
gold
dramatic
supply
confessions,
is carefully
no appeals
hoarded,
for understanding.
no longer forms
Reports
a
from those who
basis
observed
for her
him
money,
describe a man who
but
seemed
Tokyo's
almost detached,
bankers see
as
their
if watching a
turn
play about
coming
someone
later,
else's life.
when
He was
Japan
convicted on
begins
8 separate
exploiting
counts,
the
more than any other
lands it
defendant.
has conquered.
The tribunal found him guilty of conspiracy to wage aggressive
Most eagerly
war,
sought
of
securities
ordering or
on
permitting
the Tokyo
atrocities,
Stock
of
Exchange
failing to prevent
are the
crimes he knew
shares
were
of
occurring.
government-controlled
The narcotics
corporations
trafficking in China,
set up
the
to
false flag
develop the
operation at
gold
Mukden,
and
the
iron
broader
and
pattern
timber
of deception
of the
and manipulation,
Philippines,
all of it
the
laid out
abundant
in
rubber
meticulous
and tin of
detail.
Belli,
7 men
the
received
oil
death
and
sentences.
quinine of the Dutch East
Along with
Indies,
Doihara,
all
Hideki
the raw
Tojo, the
materials
wartime prime minister,
needed to make
Iwane
Japan
Matsui, who
self-sufficient
commanded at Nanking,
in a war which
Seishiro
many of its
Itagaki,
leaders
Doihara's
believe may last
co-conspirator
a
in the
century.
Mukden Incident, and 3 others.
Never an
December
inventive
22nd,
or creative people,
1948,
the Japanese
Sugamo
have
Prison in
always
Tokyo.
depended
If you
on the
picture it,
scientific
imagine not
and
the dramatic
industrial
gallows of
knowledge
Western films,
of the
but
Western
something
world.
more bureaucratic,
And now
more
that they are
industrial.
at war with
A room
Britain and the
designed for
United
the efficient
States,
execution
they
of court
find their
sentences.
chief source
The condemned
from which
men
to borrow
spent their final hours in
fast-changing
separate
production
cells.
techniques
Buddhist
in
priests
Nazi
attended
Germany.
those who wished spiritual counsel. Doihara, by accounts, remained composed. Perhaps after all the years of secrecy and manipulation, there was
in
a
the
kind of
theaters of
relief in the
Japan,
clarity of this
Nazi
final
methods
moment.
of propaganda
No
are
more
also copied
deceptions, no more
to
schemes,
good effect.
just an accounting. The executions were scheduled for just after midnight. 4 men
The
would drop
Nazi concept
simultaneously,
of total
then the
war
remaining 3 in a
is
second
highly
group.
satisfying to the
Doihara
Japanese
was in the
mind,
first group.
for
Now
throughout
there are
its modern
persistent
history,
rumors, difficult to
Japan has
verify
been a
completely, that
totalitarian
not all
state
the executions went
preparing
smoothly.
for total
Hanging,
war.
despite what popular culture suggests, is not always
Playing
instantaneous
their
if the drop
closely
isn't
supervised
calculated
part
correctly
in
based
total
on the
war
condemned
are
person's weight.
Japan's
There
metropolitan
were reports
newspapers,
of prolonged
which
suffering,
ate the great
though
American
official accounts
dailies.
described a quick, professional process.
For a stick of
Whether
pipe can be
Doihara's
set,
death was swift
must
or
be approved
agonizing,
by the
we
army,
can't know
the
with
navy,
certainty.
the police,
The records
and
are
the Foreign
ambiguous,
Office.
and those who were
No
there gave
story or
conflicting
editorial,
accounts.
no
What we
picture
do
or
know
cartoon
is that by the early
may
hours
be
of December
printed
23rd,
which
all
opposes
7
the
men
concept
were dead.
of
Their
a
bodies were cremated quickly.
Japanese-ruled
The
world.
ashes were scattered at sea or in remote
Thus, to
locations,
the Japanese reading
deliberately
public,
kept secret to prevent any
progress
graves
of their
from becoming
holy war
shrines for the
is an
unrepentant.
unbroken succession
And that
of
was the end
triumphs.
of Kenji Doihara,
Every disaster
65
becomes a
years old,
victory,
once
and
one
all
of the most powerful
news
and feared
is
men
good
in
news.
Asia, now reduced to ash,
For
scattered
every
in an
channel of
unmarked
public
location.
information
So what do we
is
take from
being
this story?
used to impress
Why
upon
does it
Japan's
matter,
people
80 years on,
that
that
the
a
war
Japanese
is proceeding
Spymaster, whose name
according
most
to a
people don't
divinely
know,
guided
lived and
plan,
died?
and
I
that the
think it
people's
matters for
part
several
is merely
reasons,
to double
and I want to spend our
and
last few
redouble
minutes
their
together thinking
sacrifices
through what this
on
story tells
behalf
us.
of the emperor
First,
and of
it
their
reminds us how
sons
wars
and
actually
fathers
start,
away at
not
the front.
usually with dramatic declarations or clear-cut invasions,
Greatest single
but with
source of
deceptions,
Japan's
false
fighting men
flags,
is
incremental
its
boundary
peasant
pushing.
population,
The
long
Mukden
used
Incident
to
is a
hard
perfect
work
case study
and
in how to
self-denial,
manufacture a justification for
toiling
aggression.
from before dawn
Create
to
an
long
incident,
after sunset.
blame your enemy,
The
use the
farm
provocation
family
to justify
accepts
response.
hard work
We've
and
seen this pattern
swallow
repeat throughout
with
history
the
in
unfeeling
different countries
stoicism
under different
of a
ideologies.
disciplined race.
Recognize recognizing the pattern helps us be skeptical when governments claim they're merely responding to provocations. Second, it shows how intelligent,
Homes are
educated people
crudely
can
built
talk themselves
with a
into monstrous
framework of wooden
things.
beams and
Doihara
walls of
wasn't
mud
some crude
and
fanatic.
chopped straw.
He was cultured,
In these
sophisticated,
huts,
spoke
Japan's
multiple
peasants
languages.
have
By
for
all accounts, he
generations
was good
raised
company,
sons
could be charming at dinner
to
parties,
fight for their emperor.
and yet he systematically destroyed lives, engineered
There are
wars,
few luxury
enabled
crops in
atrocities.
Japan today.
The lesson:
Practically
intelligence
everything
and
has been
education are not
replaced
moral
by crops
safeguards.
which give the
What matters
greatest
is the
nourishment.
framework of values you apply
All
that
grain and
intelligence
rice
to.
belong to the
Third,
state.
the story illustrates how
The
means
whole crop
corrupt
is
ends.
bought by the government
Doihara genuinely
at a
believed, I
price
think,
just
that
high
he was
enough
serving a noble
to keep the
purpose,
peasant alive and
freeing
working.
Asia from Western domination, creating an order where Asian nations would be independent and prosperous.
And in a
Perhaps
nation
in
where
some
land
abstract
is the
sense,
chief
those
source
were
of food
defensible
and
goals.
life, no
But when you
square
pursue those
foot
goals
of
through
farmland,
deception,
however
manipulation,
meager,
addiction
is
and
left
violence,
untilled.
you guarantee that what you build will be corrupt. The means become the ends.
To protect its
Fourth,
supply
it's
of
a reminder of
hardwood,
accountability.
Japan
however
has for
imperfect.
years practiced
Yes, the Tokyo
reforestation on a
trials had their
national
problems.
scale.
They were
And
victors'
today its
justice.
lumber,
Some argue they
like
applied
everything else
standards
it
to the
produces,
Japanese that the Allies
going
hadn't
into the
always
war
observed
effort
themselves.
in one way
The
or
emperor,
another.
who bore ultimate responsibility under Japanese constitutional
To
theory,
make sure that on
was
the farm
deliberately
not
shielded
an hour
from
is spent
prosecution
in
for
idleness,
political reasons.
no material
But
is
imperfect
wasted.
justice is
Every
still
rural
justice.
community
The trials
produces useful
established a principle
handicrafts.
that starting aggressive wars and committing atrocities are crimes, not just policy choices. That superiors bear responsibility for what happens under their command. That following orders isn't
In the
an absolute
towns and
defense.
villages,
These
home
principles,
industry is
first
also the
articulated
rule.
clearly at
And in
Nuremberg
these
and
homes
Tokyo,
lies much
became the
of
foundation for
Japan's
modern
industrial
international
strength.
humanitarian law.
With each home,
I want
a
to close
miniature
with a thought
factory.
about why this
The
matters
nation's
today,
total
not
production
just as history, but as
is
something living
almost
and relevant.
beyond estimate.
We live in a time when authoritarian governments are again testing boundaries,
With the same
creating
fanatic
incidents,
zeal that
pushing to see
inspires the
what they can get
soldiers,
away with.
whom they so
When
devotedly
sophisticated
support,
propaganda and
Japanese
information
people
warfare
are today
substitute
working
for
for the
Doihara's
destruction
opium
of the
networks,
land they
but serve
fear
similar
and
purposes,
hate
to
most
confuse,
of all,
to control,
the
to make
United
people
States.
dependent on narratives
a
that
land
serve
which,
power.
more than any other,
When the patterns
the
he helped
Japanese have
establish,
cause to
the false
remember
flag, the
with
incremental
gratitude
aggression, the
and
nationalist
affection.
rhetoric justifying
When in
expansion, reappear
1923
in different
Japan
contexts.
was racked and broken by an
Understanding how it
earthquake,
worked in
it was
1931
the United States
helps us recognize it in
which was first
2025.
and most generous
Not because the
in giving
situations are
aid.
identical, they never
into
are,
Tokyo and
but because the
scores of
underlying
other shattered
dynamics
and
are similar.
suffering cities
How does a
poured
democracy
millions
fail
of
to stop
American
aggression?
dollars,
How do
shiploads
intelligent
of
people
American
convince
supplies
themselves that terrible
to
means
save
are justified?
lives, to
How does
heal
the
the injured,
international order break down?
and to help
These aren't
rebuild
abstract historical
Japan.
questions. They're questions about the world we're living in right now.
Today,
there's a
Japan's
personal dimension
restored
too.
cities are filled
Each of
with
us
mills
faces
and
smaller scale
factories
versions of Doihara's
turning out
choices.
materials of
Not
war.
whether to start a war,
In these
obviously,
factories,
but
there is
whether
no
to use
shortage of
deception
labor.
to advance our goals.
Farms and
Whether to
villages
manipulate
comes
people
an
for what we
endless
tell ourselves
supply
are good reasons.
of girls
Whether
eager
to
to
sacrifice
contribute to
present
the war
ethics for
effort
future
for a
vision.
year or two.
Whether to
Before
convince
they marry
ourselves that the people we're
begin
hurting
bearing sons
somehow matter
for the
less
army
than the people we're
and
helping.
navy.
The
Willing to work
Spymaster who
14
loved
hours
Chinese
a day
culture but destroyed
little more
Chinese
than room
lives
and board,
shows us where those small
a
compromises
fine
can
factory
lead.
meal to
Not
boiled
immediately,
rice,
not obviously,
fish and
but step
tea,
by step,
better
until you find
fare
yourself
than they
complicit
had
in
at
things
home.
you never imagined at the start.
Since nearly a
I began
decade
by saying
before Pearl
Doihara's
Harbor,
name is unknown to most
Japan's
people,
heavy
and
industry
that's
has
probably
been
appropriate.
mobilized on a war
He
footing.
operated in shadows,
Its
pulled
materials,
strings, left
machine
others to
tools,
take the spotlight.
and workmen
In a sense,
integrated
dying
into a
almost forgotten is
long-range
fitting.
program
But his story deserves
build up
remembering, not to
and
glorify or
maintain
demonize him,
the
but to
Japanese
understand,
war machine.
to see how systems of deception get built, to recognize how
To make
intelligence
up
without
for
wisdom
shortages of
leads to
strategic
catastrophe,
materials,
to
it
appreciate how
accumulates great
easily the boundary
stockpiles
between
of raw
patriotism
materials
and nationalism
by
gets
importing
crossed,
them from
how
China,
quickly service to
India,
nation
the
becomes
Netherlands, East
justification
Indies,
for any action.
and from Western nations.
20 million people died in the Pacific War. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean, Indonesian, British, American, Australian, and
Japan's
others.
state religion
Most were
is Shintoism,
civilians.
which
Most
teaches
had no
that
say in
Japan
the
is a
decisions that
heavenly
led to their
land,
deaths. They were
protected
simply
by
there
their
when the
gods,
machinery of
who
war,
have even
set in
taken the
motion
form
by
of a
men like
divine
Doihara,
wind,
rolled over them.
which scattered
Every
and
one of those
confounded
20 million had a
enemy
name,
fleets.
a family, hopes
Shinto
and
gods
fears,
exist
and
in
ordinary
rocks,
human desires.
trees, and rivers.
They wanted to live,
and even
to
the
see their
souls
children
of men
grow,
who have died
to eat
for
good
their
meals
emperor
and laugh with
are
friends and
worshipped
feel the
as
sun on their
minor
faces.
gods.
Instead, they got fire and bullets and starvation and cruelty beyond description. That's the reality behind the diplomatic history, the strategic decisions,
And
the grand
in the
narratives of
immemorial
empire
fashion
and
of these
co-prosperity
ancestors,
spheres.
they
Real
fortify
people,
with pageantry
destroyed by
and
decisions made
savage
by other
symbolism,
people who told themselves
belief
they were serving
that
something
innumerable
higher.
and
Understanding
deities
that,
in
really
them
feeling it,
to be
not
the
just
Kuras
intellectually
of the
acknowledging
world.
it. That's why history matters, not just as a collection
Early
of
in
facts
life,
and dates,
Japanese
but as a
school
reminder
children
of human capacity
learn
for
to
both
feel the
terrible
proper
destruction
reverence
and
for
heroic
national
resistance,
heroes.
of
By
how easily
implanting such
civilization can
devotion,
fracture,
the
of
empire
how
is
much
assured
depends
of
on
a
the
youth
choices we make,
imbued
individually
with
and
fanatical
collectively.
courage
If
and
this exploration of
militarist
a forgotten
ideals.
architect of catastrophe has stirred something in you, questions about power, about morality,
From
about how
infancy,
history echoes
Japanese
into the present,
children find their
I
days
hope you'll continue
strictly
this journey
scheduled
with me.
to the
Subscribe to this
discipline
channel not just
of
for more
total war.
stories, but for more opportunities to
Physical
think
culture
deeply about
groups,
how we got
they
here
harden their
and where we
bodies
might be heading.
and learn the obedience
History
to
isn't
orders
just
which
about
will
the
make
past.
them good
It's about
warriors
recognizing
in
patterns,
later life.
asking difficult questions, refusing easy answers. Each week we'll explore another corner of
By
the
wreaking
20th century.
pitiless
Not
destruction
always the famous
upon
battles or
unarmed
well-known
cities
leaders,
and their
but the
helpless
revealing
people,
moments, the
and
telling
by
details,
slaughtering all
the
those who
stories that
stand in
illuminate something
Japan's
important
way,
about human nature
the
and
young
human choice.
Japanese will win
Share this
honor
with
and
friends who
grace
appreciate
in
nuance
the
over
sight of his
simplification,
gods.
complexity over
For they have
ideology,
decreed that
understanding
it is
over
Japan's
judgment.
destiny to
Build a
achieve
community of people
mastery
who
over
believe
the
that
whole
studying
world,
history carefully,
to bring to
with
all
empathy but
peoples the
without
blessings
sentimentality,
of the samurai
with moral
code.
seriousness but without self-righteousness, is one of the ways we protect ourselves from repeating its worst chapters. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult
In learning
story.
to read and write the complex
Thank you for
Japanese
being willing
language
to sit with
of more than
uncomfortable
4,000
questions.
characters,
Thank you for caring
there is
enough about
stern
the past
discipline
to
for the
learn its
mind.
lessons for the future. Until next time, may we all choose wisdom over cleverness,
never are they
humanity
allowed
over
to forget
ideology,
that
and
the way
peace
of
over
Japan
glory.
is the way of